And we're live with our 272nd episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on social media, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on social media and in real life. Seth, say hi.
Hey everyone. Apparently, I'm converting from virtual to physical form at this point, right? Not that I ever separated it out too much, but welcome to another episode. Excited to be back. I know it's been a short turnaround since we recorded on Friday as well. But just keeping up our weekly cadence, and there's always stuff to talk about. That's what we're finding, even as we drop into it. Part of what we want to do though is moving back to kind of basics of application security, right? Like things that we can do, or things that you can do in your job that will enhance application security, or enhance the security of your application. It's been a while since we really talked through like the OWASP top 10, did short snippets on that, or even did an after dark episode, reviewed some code. So we're going to get back to some of those things. Just kind of depends on life and what Ken and I have going on. So but if there is something that you're interested in seeing, if there's some source code that you'd like us to review, showing how we use LLMs, just short snippets, that type of thing, would love to have it. Join Slack, jump in there. There's a great community that is pretty active. Although as we've moved into 2020, everybody's been pretty busy, but they, constantly, constant links, constant discussion, constant response. I mean, I think the most recent thing, there was somebody asking about identifying secrets, I believe, in secret scanning in GitHub, trying to figure that out was in general. But there's a jobs channel. There's other things that are there as well. On top of that, though, we've had a slight change for the Harnessing LLMs for Application Security course. And I spelled it wrong, but on training.absoluteappsec.com, we've moved that course from this week to February 20th and 21st. We had some scheduling conflicts that had to be taken care of. Ooh. So if you're still interested, please join. That is filling up. And it's a great opportunity to learn how to use those LLMs in your daily practice, in code, in other things like gotchas, both good and bad of what we've learned over the last year and a half, and trying to use LLMs to enhance our own processes, as a third party or as a SaaS provider. Let me think. What else? I did want to give a shout out to Redpoint today for sponsoring this episode. Redpoint specializes in code security for coders, code security by coders, which is bolstered by years of experience testing applications and conducting code reviews against all types of applications. Redpoint also offers secure code training to help ground your teams in better security practices across the development lifecycle. So check out redpointsecurity.com for more information and put your company on a path to better security. Sweet. I think that's all the administrative stuff. I know we've got CactusCon coming up here fairly soon, next couple of weeks. There's other like training opportunities that are going to be popping up. We will be doing a secure code review course sometime in Q1. It'll probably be March, given that we're going to do harnessing LLMs in February. But please reach out if you are interested. We'll get those on the calendar, like the tentative dates along the, for all of the different training opportunities, especially when it's associated with a conference. Ken, anything else there?
Yeah. Well, I know a couple of the folks from my company were at Code Mash
Oh,
last
that's right.
week. Said it was a good conference. I know
Always is.
some. Yeah. They seem to enjoy it. It seemed to be a pretty light. One of the guys from our team gave a talk. Pete, I if I get the link to the talk, if they like publish it, I'll share it out. But it was it's a cool talk on detecting authorization flaws using LLMs. So yeah, they had a good time. To your point, next month we'll try to get something together with folks at CactusCon. I know we're sponsoring a sponsor of CactusCon, and I'm trying to think of what else is relevant. Oh, I guess one last thing. Tomorrow I'll share with the community, but got some cool news coming out tomorrow about dry run. So Yeah, just feeling pretty good, man. Feeling pretty positive. Feeling awesome. Like, yeah, excited for this year. So, not too much to talk about in news though for me. Other than that,
Not too much. Okay. Well, that's good, right? No, I don't know. Whatever. Um, yeah, we've got a few things to that we were considering talking about today, right? And yeah, just wanted to look into figuring out if we wanted to start with the demo, if we wanted to dive in one of the articles first. Like, what would you prefer, Ken? I know we teased it out a little bit last week, and you've talked about some of the tools that you've been using as a
yeah,
developer that have embedded LLMs. And like, I know Copilot works within Visual Studio Code, right? Like within VS Code, you can actually interact with Copilot from a chat perspective as well. I don't know if everybody's used that, not just like, hey, write this code for me, but from a chat perspective, you can ask questions. But I know there's a couple of newer tools that have popped up. And yeah, like you were talking about demoing, I think it was, I don't even remember their names,
yeah,
right? Like I know there's context is one, right?
yeah.
That's
Let
one of
me.
the IDEs.
So the two tools are going to be Warp and sorry, give me 1 second. I'm trying to share my entire screen here. Yeah, share my entire screen and probably close and share this. And then yeah, it's like so can you see like a browser, a terminal and all that?
Yes.
Okay. Is it actually sharing on the yeah, on the page? Yes. So
Hmm.
this is sharing with everybody like normally, Seth?
Yeah. Yep. Yep. I can see
Okay.
your whole window, right?
Awesome. All right. So this is Warp. And what's neat about Warp is this is like so. Sorry that it's purple, but the reason it's purple is it asked me when I fired up, like, hey, do you want to import your iTerm2 settings because it detected those, and I said yes, and so it automatically adopted all of my settings from from iTerm2. So in terms of migrating over to it, I found it like to be dead simple. And then like one thing that's really neat. So we've got a pro team account. So you'll see like meaning dry run has one. And what's cool about it is that we can share different sort of playbooks. So essentially what that is you can I'm gonna choose one that doesn't have anything like proprietary. So this one's just converting seconds to dates, for instance. And so you can see like there's these run books or these playbooks that you can like run, and that's pretty neat, right? Like you can share essentially a set of commands, a set of workflow. You can even give it like markdown instructions, basically. Like you can say like, here's how you would go through and do these different things. We have an example of that, but I don't want to share it. But I do have an example of that. I can't share for Gyrant Security just because it's got some proprietary information in there. But it's really cool. You basically can, yeah, that part's neat. The other part that's really neat though is like, for instance, you can switch from just writing like normal terminal commands, cat man, whatever normal stuff, right? To like actually asking questions. So, for instance, I think I have in my history here saved. How do I log in with SSO using AWS command line? And just so you know, it kind of detects, like a what, who, why, where question style flow to detect, hey, you're actually asking a natural language question. So, for instance, like, how do I do something? And you can see like it's already naturally switching over to that natural language question type of scenario. To get out of that, I'm going to do a backslash. But yeah, so to go back to it, it's kind of cool to see it in action. Like, how do I log in with SSO using an AWS command line? And what's cool is not only does it like answer questions, but it in the terms of based off of the data it's trained on, but also it can like run commands for you and also use the context it's gathering from your terminal and your environment to answer questions. So you should see it thinking here. Yeah. So it recognized that I already have a dry run sandbox profile created, and that I can run these commands in these orders in whatever order. And it's very helpful from like a just sort of how do I do something like for instance, how can I get rebase this project, for instance. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's like it's just kind of nice from a integrating LLMs into your actual workflow and get status and
Well,
getting it to actually do things. And yeah,
I mean, this is again, like this is one of those like speed up your process tools, right?
right,
We've talked about this in the past, like especially as Chat GPT was first launched, everybody would just go to chat.openai.com or whatever and like start typing this same sort of thing in. You're using it as like a search engine or as an added tool. But that's also taking you out of your flow, right? It's been a long time since I've seen or even considered upgrading like my terminal. Right? But
right,
this is one of those things that I'm like, oh, this would actually be helpful because I already have these subscriptions to different models, right?
right,
And access to Bedrock or whatever it is, right? It would be useful to have that currently in my just in the window that I'm at, so I don't have to flip back and forth, right? And granted, that's just a little thing, but it's similar to Copilot, right? Like Copilot within VS Code, right? The ability to have it actually just like start predicting and tabbing through like what you're trying to do is a small process improvement, but those small process improvements add up over time, right?
mm,
Um, and that's what I'm seeing here is this ability to actually flip back and forth quickly. It would be helpful, right? Like, I spend a lot of time in the terminal. Yeah, I think a lot of developers do. And so having it accessible there would be interesting, especially with the history. Um,
yeah,
yeah.
oh yeah. I mean, being able to look at yeah, because it can look at your environment, how it's set up, like your everything, yeah, your history, everything. And run commands to get the information it needs in your terminal, right? So if it doesn't know the answer, you run it, you let it run. It's basically agentic in that nature, right? You let it run its command, it comes back, gets more information, says maybe I need to ask another, or I need to run another command to get some information. But yeah, I mean, I think it's. And by the way, I want to give credit to Pete on our team, Pete Carmen, because he was the one that sort of started bringing up these solutions and pushing us towards these solutions. So credit to you, Pete. But I did want to share this with the rest of the world, right? So right. And another piece is you can switch between different models, right? It comes built in. These tools come built in with model access, so you don't even have to really do much in terms of like putting keys, or configuring keys and things like that, right? Like it for now, anyways, they seem to allow, and I don't know what the limitation is. I'm sure their pricing options show what the limitations are, but yeah, that is there's more to warp, of course. Check it out, but it's pretty cool. Yeah, it just speeds things up. So then I'm gonna show Windsurf real quick, which this one is I like, dude. This is crazy because I'll just show it, but actually, let me pull something up here so that we can compare and contrast. AppSec handouts. All right. So in our course, we offer this sort of. Oh, sorry, not that one. Example template. We give this this rough note taking outline so that you can stay on task, you can collect the right information, and this is part of our secure code review course, right? But what's cool is like I could take something like, what is the business purpose of this application, and just ask it. Right mode is not only used based on free plan, switch to read mode. Okay, cool, whatever. Switch. All right. So what is the business purpose of this application? So I opened up the Django the VTM application, which is a Django application that Seth and his folks at Redpoint wrote, and we use as part of the secure code review course. I'm sure I think you use it for other reasons as well. But yeah, so of course I'm gonna get the it's because I hold on, it's because I changed
You're using
and of
the
course upgrade now. Yeah, because I would use this earlier and I'm guessing I had actually here we go, premium. There we go. See if it'll allow me to do this. Premium. Oh my god, you gotta be kidding me. All right, well, this isn't gonna work then if I can't. So I used up all my tokens, I guess. That stinks. Well, give me a sec here and let me see if I can upgrade this because it's worth it. Let me
okay.
hold on a sec here. It's definitely worth it. So let me do this not in front of the public. And then we'll yeah, it's funny. Okay.
This is inevitably what happens, right? Like it's always that. Yeah.
Oh, inevitably, yeah. I'm pretty used to this kind of nonsense. But
Yeah.
yeah, well, so man, I can't believe that actually failed me right when I was going live. All right, let's upgrade for individuals. All right, I'm gonna just select a plan real quick.
Okay.
Sorry guys, I know this is not ideal. I didn't know that I was gonna get throttled. Whatever. Da, da, da.
Mhm. And and you can do the same. Well, I think what is it? Windsurf, right? That's the name of it. I think the integration might be a little bit better, right? But if you haven't started to play with GitHub as well for the same sort of thing, you should, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, sorta, right? Like I think that there's a bit more intelligence, but okay, I think we're back online. So I'm gonna put this up and hopefully this time I don't actually have an issue with this thing. So okay, let me share my screen. Gonna restart this super professional podcast demo. um right. All right. Yes, this is what I need. Okay, let's ask this again. All right, now it's going to search through the code base to find information about it. It's going to check the README, which is something we tell people to do as part of the course. We always tell people that's the first place you want to go, assuming there is a README, right? That's the first place you want to go. And so immediately this thing starts kind of going through and, doing its thing. So it search through the files in the code project, determine it need to look through the README, search through the code base for additional context and information. And it comes back and says, hey, this application is called VTM. It's an intentionally vulnerable task management system. All of that's accurate. It allows you to do all the things it says here, which is create and manage tasks, assign tasks to users, organize tasks within projects, blah, 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 right? So in a fraction of a second, it did the work that we normally spend, I don't know, some not, non-trivial amount of time digging up and learning about the application, right? So, what are some other questions that we ask? How about like, what's the framework it's built on? What framework or technology stack is this application built on? And we'll see what it'll talk about what it's doing to actually determine, the answer to that question. So it's going to look at our dependency file first, right? That's smart. You want to get a list of the libraries we're using. That'll help you analyze, or rather determine what kind of technology stack we've got. It's looking at the settings.py because it is a Django application. Once you know it's a Django application, you need to go look at settings.py. And so all that's really, 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 really helpful. I mean, I think,
and this is really quick too, right? Like, yeah,
it is really quick. I mean, it makes me giddy. I mean, like, how many years have we been doing this manually? And you're just like, what? So, like, let's do another way. How is routing defined in this application? So, for instance, when I send an HTTP request to this application, how is the HTTP path portion uh, processed and sent, and how are routes defined? I know that's like overloaded. I'm just kind of throwing the kitchen sink question wise at this thing. Obviously, that's kind of a sloppy query, but I mean, why not, right? Let's just see what it comes away with. So yeah, it's going to the urls.py where we define our routes. Oh, bonus, also task manager urls.py. If it saw urls.py, it certainly saw that we had configured for task manager URL. So there's two different routing files in there. Checks the views to see how they're processed. And sure enough, I'm trying not to burp, sorry. Sure enough, it comes away with, yeah, a pretty solid list of how this is all working and where these routes are defined and how they end up, being processed in the view function and the
Yep.
patterns we're using. And I mean,
Yeah.
dude, that is
Yeah.
cool.
Well, and I mean, this is part of the reason, like we're talking about doing like updates on some of our like, after dark episodes and the walkthroughs that we have with the
Yeah.
new tools. It's like, yeah, some of that pain that we've taught people about for years is becoming less, right? Or we're not having to endure it quite as much. And yeah, I mean, honestly, it's the whole reason we were excited about the harnessing LLM stuff as well, right? Because if
Yeah.
if an LLM can go in and do this for you, right? Like that was just like 2 hours worth of work to actually gather up a bunch of that stuff, or close to it, especially for junior analysts that's never seen Python before and never seen Django before, right? The amount of info that's coming back here is just so useful.
Dude, I mean,
Yeah.
it's accurate. All these vulnerabilities that I just asked it are actually in there. Now, of course, there's a lot of other vulnerabilities inside of the application, right? But the fact that it kind of, several functions marked with to do check authorization. So, I mean, I think when you start to walk this all back, you're like, man, if I'm a consultant and I'm going through and I'm doing an assessment of an application, this is pretty darn useful, right? Like, yes, this is useful for writing code. I can give it, uh, I need you to give me code that adds a route for hacker and then is processed by a function called hacker and returns to the user a statement, you are a hacker, for instance. Yes, I can do that, and it can give me code and generate the plan for that, and that's really really cool. But I think like when you dial this, or when you walk this back as a consultant, as an internal defender who reviews code, as whatever, it's like, okay, well, this is actually. And by the way, yeah, here's changes it's trying to make. I can accept, here's you know, the hacker function, I can respond with, you're a hacker. I can accept those changes. And so like, I can accept these changes. I can instantly add a route and have all the boilerplate done. Sure. That's cool as a developer, but from like a security perspective, there's just, man, I just feel like there's so much use. So anyways, these are things I'm excited about. It's like, oh, another thing, show me, how authorization patterns work and are applied in this application. I think, just rejecting all the changes so it doesn't apply them. Yeah, so I could keep throwing questions. Oh, there's another thing too that you can do that's pretty cool. So I should mention two things too. They have a concept of memories, and memories are really you kind of having an opportunity to guide the prompt a bit more. I didn't mess with those, but I'll show messing with them. So let this run, and then we'll ask one more question here after I've done a prompt change, or a memories as they call it. So again, it talks you through its execution plan that it decided to run to get the answer to our question. This is absolutely correct. We use @login required and @user passes test in this application code base. It talks you through all of the different patterns that we're using in here, the flaws that we have with them. I mean, incredible, right? I mean, just honestly incredible. I don't know what else to say there. That is amazing. But The other bit too is like the concept of these memories is you can do a few things. So whenever you have the opportunity to manage the prompt or context or anything like that, you can drastically, obviously change the results to come back. So I could provide more business context. I could give nuanced authorization patterns that are specific to this application, and then start asking questions, and it's going to have obviously more information that's very specific to this application. Or I can do things like, speak like Yoda, right? So for instance, I can ask a question now, like what HTML template language is this application using? And it'll come back with, yeah, Django's template language. This application uses, let me examine the template files, comma, I shall, right? So we got our little Yoda style here. But there's a lot of stuff you could do there, right? Like if you needed to ask some security questions and you had like the things we ask developers, like what security concerns do you have about the application? What parts of the application do you believe may be more vulnerable than others, et cetera, et cetera. And then we can start to backfill inside these memories this information, and then the Windsurf can use that information to enhance the queries it's performing and give itself more intelligence about this specific code base. So yeah, I think it's cool. I'm excited.
It is super cool. Yeah. I mean, right, like speeding up of the process, right? Like that's always been the goal, right? I mean, as many times as you and I have talked about AI and LLMs, generative AI and LLMs, and their use case for application security, these are the improvements that make us excited, right? Like not only what you're doing at dry run, which is like a whole nother level of those use cases and actually like pulling things out and replacing SaaS tools with something that's more effective and more whatever, right? Like outside of that, just the day-to-day improvements that we're seeing because of that is what gets us excited, right? Like anytime that we can take what would be a 2-hour task down to 15 minutes. Yeah, it's huge. So
I mean, it's it's kind of funny because LLMs were considered so experimental. I feel like maybe, definitely in the 14 months, 12 months, I'd say in the last few months, now the LLMs are getting so powerful that it's like, oh, okay, these are for sure sticking around and are useful, and yeah, they're only going to get better. And you see that, right? Like Sonnet's a newer one with Anthropic, and you see how well it performs. And if you were to dial that back and go back a year in terms of what was available with LLMs, or a year and a half, it's like night and day. So we're just seeing like this. It's just rapidly and progressively faster than anybody can even really keep up, So
yeah, and one of the things I still feel like there's a bunch of backlash on this, right? And there's still resistance. I was on Blue Sky the other day. I saw something from one of our past guests that's going off about like, oh, I'm just not going to let Apple, like, I'm not going to turn on Apple Intelligence for a local, like, on their phone or whatever it is, right? And like my honest question was why? What, well, I want to be able to, I want to be sure that the back and forth, right? Like it's trusted, and I'm like, okay, but not enabling it basically decreases your own productivity and efficiency gains that could be added there. And not only that, but you become unfamiliar with it, and anybody that you deal with that is using Apple products is probably going to turn that on and start to use it. Yes, there's places where it's probably not great right now, but in the case of a local LLM that actually is answering questions or summarizing emails or, looking at code, whatever it is, right? That's an efficiency gain over time that we've got to be familiar with, and we've got to be able to secure, right? And part of that starts with our own use patterns with it. I mean, that was the initial problem we had, and I know you had with ChatGPT as well. Everybody was like, "Oh, well, we can't send them our data," that sort of thing. And I'm like, yeah, but then the knee-jerk reaction of, no, I'm not going to enable that because it's Apple Intelligence or it's ChatGPT or whatever, is discounting the improvements that can be had there, right? Like, and I was just surprised. I mean,
Yeah.
you could look back through my Blue Sky history and see who it was, but I was just surprised that the response was so negative to something that I mean, honestly, like from a developer perspective, like developing Hacker Tracker, right, for conference applications, I'm like, I'm looking into use of Apple Intelligence for supported platforms to actually summarize, hey, what is it that you're actually going to be attending, right? Like I go in favorite events, and then I can actually search the database for other style events using the LLM, and I don't have to depend on tags that are generated by the conference themselves or other things. I can be like, hey, it looks like you're interested in application security talks. This talk, even though it's not titled or labeled in the application security group, or track, actually has very relevant bits that are associated with other talks that you've already favorited, right? Like that is a useful thing that I can provide as a feature. Yeah, because of Apple Intelligence. And so I question the, oh, we've never done this. But I also like, I know I'm kind of going off, but on the flip side, I also get the reticence of not trusting these large organizations because in the past they've burned us. But at this point, right, like Google already knows everything about you, right? Like we trust them with all of our email and plain text. What else do you want, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, that's kind of a point that I had is like, when you see the resistance, it's interesting because, I mean, unless you're a person who also had that same resistance to say like an Alexa device or, I mean, if you have an iPhone, you've got already Siri and intelligent things and data being, sent off constantly. Or, a Google device, right? Like if you've got the Google Mesh Network at home, any number of these devices that are essentially, assistants, unless you resisted those as well. I mean, it's kind of a silly, it's just, well, hey, teach their own. But I can tell you honestly, like, man, from just a productivity standpoint with looking through code, getting the information that I need, it's nuts. It's cool to see like it just get better and better and better and better. So anyways, not to beat that horse to death, but man, these tools have been making my life a lot easier. This is kind of what Sneak was going after too with Cursor, right? Cursor does something similar to Windsurf. And Copilot. And so that was kind of, not to bring that up again for any reason other than to say that's just so you have an idea of what Cursor does. It's very similar to Windsurf. And so anyways, but also so that's from a defensive standpoint, like how it's useful defensively. And yeah, I agree. Like, I don't understand why people I can't understand. No, that's not true. I can understand some hesitance here, but also like I see what you're saying. But I would say also offensively, it's an opportunity in terms of research to find, flaws that potentially extract, sensitive information from IDs, from terminals. Obviously, if your terminal has, workflows that are being pulled from somewhere, maybe there's an attack surface there to exploit. So, it's both from an offensive standpoint and defensive standpoint. There's some interesting bits here. Yeah. It's exciting times, man. Come on, you can't say it's not exciting. There's more stuff to attack. There's more stuff to use to defend. It's an exciting time, and you and I have been doing this a long, long time. If we're excited, I feel like that's a good marker for something being actually unique and cool.
Yeah.
So
it is.
Anyways, cool. I know we have other stuff we want to chat about too today, so I'll get off my
check it. No, that's all good. Yeah. As you have some time, play with those Windsurf, with Warp, even with the, like Copilot chat as well. Like compare and contrast, right? Anything is helpful in those cases. So cool. All right. So we've got a couple of articles that we did want to talk through today. The first one that caught my eye, actually, and I'm going to post it here, is just a recent article at seaside.dev. The name of it is The Cost of False Positives. And this is something that pops up fairly often in my space, or in, as a consultant specifically. And I'm sure like we can talk to it as well, like the reduction in false positives that you're seeing and how effective that is. But let's take a look at the article really quick. I'll just share a screen and we can talk through it before we get into our analysis, right? Right, like so these guys, like they found an attack, led to some better detection rates. Their main website was flagged as suspicious because of the research they had done and what they had pushed out as like malicious content, right? Like, from VirusTotal. Basically, VirusTotal had identified their website as suspicious because of the research that they were pushing out on the blog, which is, I mean, it happens, right? Like, we've seen this quite often in the protection spaces, right? Like I try to do something good and get punished for it because of whatever happened. I mean, it's really a false positive, right? Like they're not vulnerable. They're not pushing out malicious content, but they happen to be talking about an issue that they found. And what happened is, it seems like there's some sort of lazy detection rules that caused the issue, right? Like the way that they had actually, they were parsing content and checking for vulnerabilities on websites led to them being flagged as a malicious website, right? And by virus, and I think was it VirusTotal that actually like identified it?
Yeah, it's VirusTotal.
Okay, yeah. Which is pretty common, right? Like regular expressions are hard. And it's usually pretty easy to be like, oh, if you're mentioning this domain, right, then maybe you are a malicious site as well, right? Like it's just that, the intersection of malicious sites to malware to, phishing emails and compromised sites that then become suspicious, right? It's just that juxtaposition that it caused a false positive, right? So all right, that's what occurred. But what I was really interested here is the real cost associated with false positives, right? And this goes back to our history with SaaS tools specifically and dynamic tools as well. I have recent examples that I can share, but you and I, like the first project that we were on together at the very large retailer, we were doing source code analysis, but we were doing it from the scope of, hey, we're scanning source code using a static analysis tool, and here is the output, and became an exercise in false positive reduction. That's all that we did. We combed through tens of thousands of findings from a SaaS tool, reduced the false positives, and told them realistically what it was that they needed to fix. And in order to do this, we had to understand at least a little bit about the code, but we also had to understand the tool that they were running against it. And I think it was AppScan or Ounce Labs at the time.
Yeah, Ounce at the times. Yeah.
And this was one of the premier, like it was one of the most popular static analysis tools at the time. It's been purchased and moved between companies since then. But one of the ones that everyone was using. So we know that everybody was getting false positives out of, Ounce Labs, out of Fortify, out of any of the static analysis tools that existed. But there is a real cost associated with that, right? Like they were paying consultant time to go in and reduce false positives on what was coming out of a tool. And I feel like this is still ongoing, that the amount of money that we spend basically arguing with tool output or arguing with regular expressions because they don't understand context is massive, right? Like I have one, I think I've mentioned it before. I have one company that I work with that they're being scanned by one of their customers using a dynamic tool and then being forced to justify low and informational severity findings that are coming out of this dynamic tool as to why the application is coded in such a way and why they can't actually reduce that risk. And again, I'm talking about low and informational risk findings or severity findings coming out of a dynamic tool. And when it comes down to it, we start to look at how much money my customer has spent, right, trying to support one of their customers, and they're the security team over there has decided is, critical risk items that don't necessarily have an effect overall. And we're arguing against what a tool is spitting out that is also inconsistent, because, we could get into why dynamic tools are inconsistent as well. But there are real costs associated with false positive. I feel like I'm going off here, Ken, but what is it that when it comes down to false positives, what is your feeling about the real cost, about the disruption that goes into it here, right? They talk about a couple of, different items. But what are your feelings when it comes to false positives?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's so many ways to answer that, or so many times I've had to deal with this, and so I've seen it become a blocker for business deals, right?
Mm-hmm.
Genuinely, where there's a lot of go between, where it's like, well, our folks say that there are these vulnerabilities, there's these issues, so we need to delay essentially, or do more due diligence. It's an extreme case. Obviously, that's not the common one that you see. Okay, so more practically and more common, when it comes from a tool, people have just gotten to the point where they accept this from tools, and it's kind of sad, actually. Like when I there's a talk, that I've given in the past, and you and I adapted it, but it's talking about how we got to where we're at and where I think the future of AppSec is going. And in that talk, I usually tend to end it and ask, okay, so today, show of hands who's comfortable with their tooling being accurate up to 80%, 70%, 60%, right? Right about when I get to 40%, that's when I see the majority of hands raised. So that's what we're comfortable with as an industry. That's tangentially or anecdotally, that's what I've come away with, is that about 40% we acknowledge our tools give us. That's super sad.
Wait. Wait. Yeah. So you're saying that I just want to reiterate
false positives.
Yeah, that we're expecting 60% of the items coming out of our tools to be false positives.
Yeah. And the real positives that come out of them are not that useful. It's pretty few and far between, when you get something that's actually useful. There's a lot of reasons for that. Can walk through why with tooling that happens, but that's the reality. So that's our level of comfortability. And personally, I believe that that's why you see, and I've talked about this before, why you see so many discussions, so many talks, even technology that's come out to address managing bug tickets at scale. It's because we're filing bug tickets at a crazy rate due to the false positives that these tools generate, and the human beings that have to go and actually, go and analyze whether or not that's a real risk or not. Now, a follow-up to all that is then when humans do it, right? So when a tool does it, it's like, okay, well, the tools to date they don't use the technology that's now available to us. They've been using a different type of technology, using AST trees and creating nodes and doing checks against that, case statements against that, looking for certain types of patterns. Okay, cool, whatever. We were limited. But when humans do it, it's, to me, that's tough, right? So what I mean by that is when you get somebody who you pay money for a pen test or whatever, or not, right? So I'll give you an example. So when you pay somebody money and they give you back results and those results aren't real, yeah, obviously that's horrible, and you're probably never going to go back to that vendor. There's other cases though, and this is the one that really chaps my behind, we'll say, and I actually had to, just because you and I don't use this podcast as a platform to take out our personal sort of vendettas or professional ones, right? We would never do that. So I purposefully did not say the name of the company, but there was a company and I won't say the name, but there was a company who they do automated. Essentially, they tell you that you've got some critical vulnerability, and they craft the email up so that you actually think like you have a legitimate vulnerability, and then you're supposed to engage with them, and then really it's just setting you up to get like their testing, or it's just their sales funnel essentially that now you're in to get testing done. The sleaziest, shittiest way, but I experienced this, I don't know, I mean, we'll say within the last 6 or 8 months. And they sent me an email. I was like, oh, do we actually have like this flaw? And so I go through the code, I do dynamic and static testing. I can't find a single thing that makes any of that seem true. And I'm like, and then it dawns on me what's going on, right? And then I start to like look into this company more, and I start to realize what's happening. And man, I was furious. And it took me, because you got to understand that I got this email, I think like on a weekend or later at night or whatever. And so like now I'm spending all this time as a CTO, genuinely concerned, and then it's all just nonsense. So those are the different ways I've seen false positives like really, really cause a lot of issues and lead to a lot of problems. But what about you? I mean, I know you've got plenty of personal stories around false positives.
Yeah, yeah, and I like, some of it, comes from being external, right? Like being a third party, trying to help organizations identify vulnerabilities, fix issues that are associated with them. I almost feel like it's a crisis nowadays, right? Like the number of findings that are coming out of automated tools that are getting pushed into, vulnerability management tooling, right? Like we've created a whole sector of security that is related to managing vulnerabilities and the vulnerability life cycle, right? And which is a good thing. The problem is if 60% of the findings are false positives, it means that we've got to reduce that. And I would almost argue that false positive rates are actually higher than that. From a true risk and a true severity perspective, the amount of false positives coming out of most tools is, I mean, honestly, like 10% maybe are true positives as opposed to false positives. And this even goes for, as sad as it is, things like the burp scanner, right?
Right.
Most usefulness that I get out of those tools is an assurance that I'm not missing some of the low-hanging fruit. But even like some of the premier things with request smuggling and SSRF and, stuff that will be flagged as high and, critical risk doesn't really equate to actual vulnerabilities in most of the applications that I test. Right? And so that's where I run into these issues. And then on the program side, when I'm helping companies, they just have fatigue, right? Like that second bullet point there, the SOC analyst fatigue, they basically ignore the tools because they know that it's a waste of time to go in and do anything. And as great as things like dependency check and sneak and like, identifying vulnerabilities in packages is, right? We want to keep things up to date. The fact that there are so many more vulnerabilities that pop out because of the use of outdated packages has just made the problem worse. And I know there's a lot of research that's going into it with reachability analysis, exploitability analysis to try and reduce those false positives, or at least reduce the load and the severity and the risk that's associated with it. It's still become an issue. And I think a portion of this too is like, we go back to Jerry's research on CVEs and, the amount of CVEs that are released on a yearly basis where those actually like hit and what the criticality of those CVEs are, right? That it's all important research, but it doesn't always equate to a true finding for users of that package, users of that software due to context issues, right? And so it's taking a lot for analysts, for security engineers to analyze vulnerabilities, to actually like come up with a plan that makes their company more secure. And it's pretty disheartening. I mean, you and I talk about this from a code review perspective, right? Like the amount of times that we go down rabbit holes or on side quests that don't equate to actual vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
It's discouraging. It takes time. You have to be pretty resilient to get over the fact that, oh, maybe they coded something properly. So just because there are sniffs of SQL injection, for example, doesn't mean there's an actual vulnerability there. And just because they're using string concatenation does not mean that they have a SQL injection vulnerability. It means that it could
Yeah.
lead to it. That's a best practice finding for sure. But if I can't identify SQL injection because of string concatenation, we shouldn't actually tell them that there is SQL injection in the code base, right? Like that seems like a fairly straightforward thing. However, you will see that in static analysis tools that they will pop up and be like, oh, there's got to be SQL injection here because of X, Y, and Z. And it turns out that there's not, right? Because for whatever reason, like it's not controllable. They don't see that specific parameter was cast to an integer or whatever it is, right? Like, and it's causing real heartburn for security engineers. It's getting popped up to management. So management is screaming at the security engineers and the developers as to why these things are listed as critical risk. You've got customers that are seeing those reports that are coming out of those tools that don't want to buy the solution until it's fixed when it's not a real problem. And we are losing trust as a security, as a security tool, as a security industry. If we cry wolf for every vulnerability that's out there, and that's been a constant thing, right? Like you only have so much political capital within an organization to tell them to fix things. And if you're constantly crying wolf on every false positive, on every vulnerability that comes out of these tools, you're going to lose that capital very quickly and you're going to get ignored.
Yes, you brought up quite a few things, and so I'm trying to.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm just going through my
start with
laundry list, right? Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So, okay, couple things. Okay. Sorry, I'm organizing my thoughts here. All right. So, first thing to mention out of everything you just said, it highlights why we talk about when you're reviewing code to run your tools, whatever those tools might be, at the end of your assessment. And there's a couple reasons. For one, you as a human being have more context for what you were talking about. Is like, if you run that tool and it has results, you as a human being have more context to more easily go through and say, yeah, that makes sense, or no, that does not make sense. So that's one of the reasons. The other one is the one that you mentioned, which is it's easy to get off track if you run those tools up front, chasing down nonsense. It's better to do all of the upfront information gathering, tracing, all of the things that you have to do, all the stuff that we talk about, doing all of that work up front and then running a tool later so that you can more easily digest what's real, what's not, but also not get distracted by nonsense. So that's, and frankly, like if I'm given 80 hours and realistically that means maybe 65 hours because of 15 hours of reporting and editing and all that. I don't know what it is, right? Maybe it's 10 hours, maybe it's whatever. Just making stuff up. So let's say it's actually 65 hours. Well, I want to spend 60 hours doing all that manual work and maybe 5 hours vetting and going through the results and running those tools. Just as an example. So that's the first one. The next thing that you talked about were like, tools that have high false positive rates, not people, but tools themselves. And that one's interesting because you mentioned a few things. You said, well, it degrades trust. Absolutely. Sure. Yeah. Trust in the tool and the alerts. But my problem is there's usually two ways that kind of tooling is used, right? One is to say like hard stop, stop what you're doing. There's obviously something critical going on here. We have to address this and then fix it and then move on, right? That's not usually what happens. What ends up typically these days happening is um, unless somebody gets that like in the shift left era, developers will maybe get a signal that, hey, there's some sort of vulnerability. All right, well, unless it's very obvious that yes, there is a vulnerability, and I understand that, what's more likely to happen? Well, a bug ticket gets filed, and that's the crux of my issue, is that we end up with this whole world in which you're managing bug tickets, and that bothers me almost. And I would say the thing that bothers me the most with false positives would be the human beings that pass along false positives. That's the one that bothers me the most, because like tools have had their evolution and they're evolving rapidly right now, and they kind of sucked for a while, but they were the best that we had because of the technology limitations that we've had for the last few decades. Well, we're not there anymore and things are improving, but I understand that, right? I get that. But what bothers me is when humans, either pass along the output of those tools without doing their job, or maybe didn't come from a tool. Maybe they just didn't do enough vetting, or they didn't talk to, their client enough to understand the business well enough, or maybe they just gave a crap finding. And that's the one that bothers me, because there's really no reason for that to occur, and yet it still occurs.
Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah. And sometimes it comes from like lack of understanding of what the vulnerability actually is, not trusting their own intuition, not getting the context of what actually is going on. Yeah. I mean, I keep going back to that one company that's arguing with their customer, right? Like, because one of the findings that we're arguing with them has to do with like CSP settings, right? Like content security policy settings on specific pages for an application. And their argument is like, oh, like for frame ancestors, the ability to actually like create an iframe, embed the application within another application or another website, right? Their argument is like, oh, well, you're using a wildcard within that, right? Like within that frame ancestors. And I'm digging into the weeds here, right? Like, but stay with me for a minute. So they argue that, oh, you're using wildcards, and it's not just like wildcards like all domains. It's like wildcards to a specific domain, like subdomains of a domain of another customer that wants to embed the application into their within their website, which is allowed, right? And the way that they have structured their application, this other customer, not the initial customer, is that the domain is not static, right? Like, or the subdomain is not static. The domain is, but the subdomain is not. So we have to use wildcards. Right? That's it. But the amount of time that we have spent arguing with them that this is not a true security risk, because you have to actually take over this other customer's domain in order to iframe the issue. And then you've also got other protections in place within that iframe itself nowadays, right? Like, and you can't actually do a lot of this cross site style attacking even within the iframe. If you've ever tried to do it within JavaScript, it's just showing the lack of understanding from customer one's security team on what the vulnerability is and what the actual impact of having that in a CSP header is. There's so many other targets that are out there that don't have restrictions in place at all, that I don't get why we're arguing it, right? Like, that's been the context of what we go back and forth on, is why is this still an issue? Why do we have to justify the architecture of another customer's application to you in order for you to feel comfortable to use that site or that application in general, right? Like, it just, yeah. I mean, again, like, I'm getting frustrated just thinking about it, but there's a true business impact, a true cost that's associated with arguing about this, when it doesn't really improve the security of the application in the wider context or within the context of that customer in and of itself. Yeah.
Said well said.
Anyway, right? Like, so I don't know. I did want to bring up too, like, Talos's response in Slack, right? He said that 60% is not, an acceptable rate, like false positive rate. But it's interesting to consider what the alternative is. Is it 0% true positive rate from running no tools or finding a way to get better?
I have seen,
Yeah.
I don't know the answer, but I will tell you, it's funny that that you're bringing this up and that he said that, because I actually have had someone come on, actually more than one person. I say come on, like so there was a response to a message, and then there was an actual meeting where this came up with a different person. They're like, we are getting rid of, and I have gotten rid of all of our tools. We're starting from scratch. We have just said none of them are helping, none of them are doing what we want. Now they're going to put back in their own proprietary checks. That's the long term plan for very specific things. But yeah, they're like leaning more into secure patterns and standards. I'm not saying this is right, right? This isn't my opinion. I'm just telling you what I've heard. So they got so frustrated that they just got rid of all of their tooling in both instances and just went a different route, like looking for specific patterns, going for secure guardrails, handling things via, training, all the different ways that you can help to secure your internal development, but without any like tooling. So again, I don't know, it's interesting. I don't blame them. I see why. I'd be curious to hear other people's opinions on this. So drop that in Slack, please, or on this YouTube in YouTube comments. But if you're listening to most of our I should say, I was going to say viewers, but most of our listeners tend to come through podcast, not through YouTube, not through viewing the video, but listening. So
Yeah.
I would say if you're listening to this later, and especially because we have folks in all kinds of different time zones, drop into Slack. You can start a thread under Talos's comment, or you can start a new thread. But yeah, let's talk
Let's
about
it.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah. Because I do have, like, I see both sides, right? Like I've got customers that we've been working with for a number of years that, like within their DevOps pipeline, like we're talking about it now, we dropped static analysis outside of like simple semgrep with patterns that we like were known issues in the past. But we dropped dynamic analysis from their DevOps pipeline, their DevSecOps pipeline, because it wasn't effective, right? And it made more sense for ProdSec or AppSec to go look at the application on a release basis and actually identify things because we have context than it did to send a tool at it and deal with the vulnerabilities, because it just ended up being a waste of time, right? So time and effort. So I get that pushback. Especially given the state of dynamic testing, right? And dynamic scanners. One of the questions that they had, they're like, oh, like, should we, pay for Burp Enterprise? And I'm like, man, have you ever tried to use Burp Scanner, right? And seeing what the coverage looks like and trying to like replicate things, like you're better off using, when you understand your product, you're better off using actual like tests and actual like nuclei request responses and login patterns rather than just like the strict discovery that comes out of something like Burp Enterprise. And that doesn't mean that Burp Enterprise doesn't have its place like on an internal network where you have multiple apps and there's like a lot of things to go through and scan, but it's also very hard to use it as a scalpel to against an application that you are very knowledgeable about. Yeah. Anyway, jump into Slack. Let's have a discussion about false positives, how you're dealing with them. I would really be interested in, especially within the context of vulnerability management, how much time you spend on false positives in general. I know as we were dealing with Ounce, right, over time and doing that over the course of like a full year, it came to the point that we started to recognize which of the finding names were always false positives. Like it was very rare that they were a true finding. And so we could just eliminate almost full classes of findings within, I think was C or Java at the time, right? Just based on the name of the finding, right? We were always like, yeah, but they're not using this, right? So a simple one was like MD5, right? Like anytime it would see the pattern MD5, it would tell you it was a security issue, even though they were just using it for file integrity or, integrity checks, whatever it is, wasn't being used for hashing of passwords or anything along those lines. Like that's kind of a simple example, but there was multiple types like that you could just classify and, eliminate pretty quickly. But again, you have to spend the time to get to that point to recognize what it is. Yeah, Ken, I'm going off on false positives now, apparently, right? So yeah.
I was wondering because if this one was a topic you actually brought up, so I was just actually thinking, I was like, I wonder what got Seth all fired up about false positives. Because obviously, like, I spend all my time thinking about false positives. I spend literally most of my day and my time on something that is designed to reduce this crappy sort of output that we've been dealing with. But you're the one who brought this up, so it's kind of interesting because I wouldn't have expected this to be like a thing that you were super passionate about.
Again, it all goes back to the Crocs and socks. Yeah, I mean, I keep bringing up the customer, and it's like this has been like a year and a half of dealing with with one of my clients with their customer that is a like Fortune 10 company, right? Has a huge infosec team and is trying to justify or to tell me that like whatever crappy dynamic scanner that they use to scan their to scan their products, the apps that they use, that's better than actual context of the people that are designing the product, right? And I like that's where it's stemming from in my world. Outside of the fact that I just see increases in the number of vulnerabilities, right? Like, especially since I started Redpoint, right? Like helping people push vulnerabilities into, what we're terming, application security posture management tools now, right? Like, sorry, apparently I've got like issues with that as well, but we're not going to dig into that today. But we're pushing vulnerability reports out of all of these different tools into dashboards. And then we have to integrate those dashboards with development pipelines. And even if it's only 60% of the findings that are coming out of these tools can't be trusted, why are we doing this integration, right? Like, if half of the items that we push into a developer's backlog are invalid, we're damaging our relationship with them. They're going to start ignoring the evidence and they're going to start ignoring the advice that we have to fix the application because most of what they see on a day-to-day basis is false, right? I mean, I would do the same thing, right? Like if half of the information that I get from social media is misinformation or disinformation, I'm going to ignore social media, right? Like it's.
Wow, you bring up an interesting.
That's point. Yes, I know. That's true, right? Like I probably shouldn't go there.
Yeah, I don't know if you should bring up that as an example, but all right.
Okay, so if half of the notifications that I get from, like think about it, right? Like you subscribe to.
If Clint's TLDR sec was sending me a bunch of links that go nowhere, for instance, if they were 404
or half of them was just BS, right? Like it wasn't real research.
Nonsense. Yeah. It would be like, exactly. Be like, well, this isn't useful, but it's not. It's amazing. Thank you, Clint.
Yes, TLDR sec is amazing. Yes, but if half of that was exactly, and you would ignore it. That's what it would come down to. Even if 20% of it was false, right? Like if if one in 5 of those links was bogus, over time, you would eliminate that as a source of information that you would use.
Yeah. Of course I would. I mean, what would be the? And again, I recognize again, like my complaints more with human beings that do it. Like I think you and I both understand, and I think our listeners understand. Like, processes and tooling, they evolve over time as things get better, as underlying technologies get better. That's just how all things work, right? That's how evolution works. So it's okay to start with something that's like not great. And then, try to improve it over time. We've definitely seen that, obviously. When we just first started with like application scanning, it was not much more than regex, right? That was really the way
Yeah.
that people did it. And then it sort of started to evolve where it was like, okay, well, we can do a little bit more. We can determine sort of the structure of the code itself. We can start creating, flows with call graphs as to where input and output flows. Or if we're talking about dynamic scanning, it's like, well, we'll look for like these files in these folders, and then applications evolved and got more complex. And so the dynamic testing changed, and the kinds of requests that we made, and the things we were looking for, and the responses, and the timing behind it. And yeah, all of that has evolved. And it's getting, maybe incrementally better. I think we're in a world now where, because like, underlying technology and foundational technology is new, like it's getting much, much better. But yeah, we had to start somewhere. I think we're at a pivotal moment right now where it's going to get much better. But again, my complaints, probably it just bothers me more with people rather than tooling. Cause I get why tooling is where it's been at.
Yeah. And I guess that's also like my own complaint as well, right? Like, because I'm dealing with people that are taking output from tooling and just sending it across without any analysis, right? That they're not trying to take into account the context of the application, the actual risks, like the threat model around it. Like, we've spent all this time building these different processes and these methodologies for assessing risk and assessing, criticality of applications and vulnerabilities. And then people are just trusting, really trusting of tools to spit something, right back across, aren't digging in it like they should be. And I just feel like I'm throwing up my hands, right? Like, cause
yeah,
what do you want from me, right? Like, outside of you're losing credibility, and if I push this to developers, I'm going to lose credibility, and that's not something I'm willing to do. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
anyway, I know we had another article to talk about. We can talk about application honeypots maybe next time, or I'll drop the link into the newsletter and we can have a discussion there. Yeah. Because
Awesome.
apparently there was a lot that I needed to get off my chest about false positives. So there we go.
Nah, I get it. It's nefarious. It's annoying. It diminishes trust. It takes up a lot of time for teams to do the investigation into, and there's the emotional cost. There's the financial cost. There's the exhaustion cost. I don't know what you'd call that, fatigue. So there's all kinds of reasons why it sucks and it's nefarious. Yeah, and also one last thing I wanted to, going back to the original beginning demos, or the first part of the podcast, just a footnote here. If you're on I believe it's with Windsurf, if you're on the individual plan, you have to go in and disable it. So talking about people being hesitant to use stuff, you actually have to go into your settings if you're on an individual, not team plan, and disable it from training on your code base. So just to be clear, like, there are good reasons to be training for sure. Yeah, there are good reasons to be at least cautious with these technologies. However, easy enough to disable. So just an FYI.
Yeah, be aware. So sweet. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining today. As always, jump into Slack to continue the conversation. Let's talk more false positives there. And did I just freeze?
You froze for me, but I don't.
Oh, okay. There we go. I came back. Man, I'm having like network issues today again. Yay. So anyway.
Don't you, well, actually, I won't ask your provider on camera. Never mind. All right. We're going to do that.
No worries. Join us on Slack. We'll chat with everybody there. Appreciate it. And we'll see everybody next week. Thanks all.